The village of Cetford Magna had, over the centuries, developed a particular talent for minding its own business, which is to say, it had developed an equally particular talent for minding everyone else's. It was the sort of place where the postman knew which households received letters from solicitors, where the greengrocer could tell you with quiet authority which families were living beyond their means, and where a new face at the Sunday service was remarked upon with the kind of gentle, penetrating interest that passed itself off as Christian warmth. It was a handsome village, Cetford Magna. The high street curved in a gentle arc past the chemist, the lending library, and the tea-rooms, and the houses set back from the lanes had the well-kept look of people who took pride in appearances, which, as Miss Marple had long observed, was not always the same thing as taking pride in the truth. On this particular Sunday in late May, the village was at its most agreeable. The chestnut trees had come into full and extravagant bloom. The war memorial at the green was garlanded with the first sweet williams of the season, and the air carried that particular combination of cut grass and warm stone that made England seem, for a few weeks each year, entirely forgivable. Mrs. Honoria Fitch, widow of the late Gerald Fitch, retired surveyor and current president of the Cetford Magna Horticultural Society, was hosting her monthly Sunday gathering at Wisteria Cottage. These gatherings were not, strictly speaking, a social obligation. They were, however, treated as one. To decline an invitation from Honoria Fitch was to make a statement, and most of Cetford Magna preferred to leave such statements unmade. Wisteria Cottage was neither a cottage nor particularly overwhelmed by wisteria, though a respectable amount of the plant did cling to the east-facing wall. It was a solid Georgian house behind a low stone wall, with a garden that Honoria maintained with a ferocity that she would have described as passion, and her neighbours might have described as aggression. The roses were immaculate, the borders were severe. Even the bees, one felt, were expected to behave themselves. By 3:30, the drawing-room was pleasantly full. Dr. Alistair Pemberton sat in the armchair nearest the window, doing what he always did at these gatherings, which was to look as though he were listening while thinking about something else entirely. He was 61, lean and precise in his movements, and had been the village GP for the better part of 3 decades. He was respected rather than liked, which suited him well enough. Beside him on the settee was his wife, Caroline, who was younger by some 12 years, and considerably more interested in the room around her. She was a pretty woman of the angular, restless sort, the kind who rearranged things on mantelpieces at other people's houses and did not notice that they did so. She was speaking to Dorothea Fitch, Honoria's daughter-in-law, with the animated energy of someone who had news to share, and was taking the long route to sharing it. Dorothea was listening with the polished patience of a woman who had spent 15 years married into a family with opinions. She was dark-haired, quiet, and possessed of a stillness that some people found restful, and others found unsettling. Her husband, Edmund Fitch, Honoria's only son, stood near the fireplace talking to the Reverend Harcastle, with what appeared to be great sincerity, and was almost certainly mild desperation. The Reverend Harcastle was a tall man with the kind of face that encouraged confession, open, mild, and perpetually slightly concerned. He had arrived in Cetford Magna 4 years prior, and had learned, with admirable swiftness, that the village's spiritual needs were secondary to its social ones. 2 further guests completed the party. Mrs. Vera Stockbridge, a retired schoolteacher of 70, who sat very upright with a cup of tea balanced on her knee, and her companion for the afternoon, Miss Jane Marple, who had accepted the invitation with the gentle pleasure of someone who genuinely enjoys the company of others and the additional private pleasure of someone who finds them genuinely instructive. Miss Marple sat in a low chair near the corner table on which the scones had been arranged, plain and fruit, with small pots of clotted cream and 3 varieties of jam. She had, in the gentle chaos of arrivals, already noticed several things. She had noticed that Edmund Fitch had glanced at his watch twice since his mother left the room to attend to the tea things. She had noticed that Caroline Pemberton, for all her animated conversation with Dorothea, had not once looked directly at her. She had noticed that Dorothea's left hand, resting in her lap, was held rather too still, the deliberate stillness of someone making a conscious effort not to fidget. And she had noticed that the scones which Honoria had declared with some pride to have made herself that very morning were not quite level on the plate. One had been shifted. A small thing, quite possibly nothing at all. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea and thought, as she often did in such company, of a woman she had known in St. Mary Mead many years ago, a Mrs. Calder, who had hosted the most beautiful luncheons and had, beneath that smooth surface, harboured feelings about her sister-in-law that would have shocked the parish. People, Miss Marple reflected, were very seldom entirely what they appeared to be in pleasant rooms on fine afternoons. Honoria returned from the kitchen, carrying a fresh pot of tea. She was a handsome woman of 73, full-figured, white-haired, and possessed of the easy authority of someone accustomed to being the most capable person present. She moved through the room with the assurance of long habit, pausing to refill cups, to press scones upon those who hesitated, and to direct the conversation with the light, firm touch of an experienced conductor. "Miss Marple," she said warmly, arriving at the corner chair, "you must try the fruit scones. I've used the last of the Seville marmalade. Gerald always said it was the only proper accompaniment." "How very kind," said Miss Marple, accepting her plate with both hands. "And how clever of you to have kept it. One does find, with marmalade, that the very best jars have a way of disappearing before one means them to." Honoria laughed, a full, confident sound, and moved on. Miss Marple looked down at her plate. Then she looked very briefly and very quietly across the room at Dorothea Fitch, who was at that moment staring at her own scone with an expression that might, in another context, have been described as dread. She looked away before anyone could notice. Outside, the chestnut trees swayed in the warm May air, and Cetford Magna continued its unhurried afternoon. It was, by any measure, a perfectly pleasant gathering. It would not remain so for long. The tea had been poured, the scones distributed, and the conversation had settled into that particular rhythm which characterizes English social gatherings of a certain kind, agreeable on the surface, industrious beneath. The Reverend Harcastle had steered Edmund away from the fireplace and towards the subject of the Horticultural Society's summer fete, which was, the Reverend felt, safer ground than whatever Edmund had been attempting to say before Honoria returned. Edmund responded with the practised civility of a man who has learned that agreeing with clergymen is rarely costly. "The rose display this year will be exceptional," Honoria announced to the room at large, settling herself into the high-backed chair at the head of the low table, as naturally as a judge assumes the bench. "I've had 3 new David Austin varieties come through since March. The progress has been remarkable." "You do have a gift," said Mrs. Stockbridge, who had been coming to these gatherings for 11 years, and had learned that complimenting Honoria's roses was both accurate and strategically sound. "It's not gift so much as discipline," Honoria said, with the mild firmness of someone correcting a pleasant error. "Roses respond to consistency, to attention. Most living things do, in my experience." Her eyes moved, briefly and without apparent intention, to Dorothea. Dorothea was spreading cream on her scone with the focused care of someone who had decided that this small task deserved their complete attention. She did not look up. "I've always found roses rather unforgiving," said Caroline Pemberton, with a bright smile that suggested she found the quality charming rather than cautionary. "You give them everything, and they still sulk if the drainage isn't quite right." "That," said Honoria, "is generally the fault of the gardener rather than the rose." A brief silence followed, the kind that has content. Dr. Pemberton set down his cup. "I believe Dorothea has been doing some planting of her own this spring. Haven't you, Dorothea? Edmund mentioned a kitchen garden." It was, Miss Marple noted, an oddly specific thing for a man of his careful manner to introduce. She watched Dorothea look up from her scone, not at Dr. Pemberton, but at Edmund, just for a fraction of a second, before her expression settled into something pleasant and neutral. "Only herbs and a few vegetables," Dorothea said. "Nothing ambitious. I thought it would be useful." "Useful," Honoria repeated, in the tone of someone turning a word over to examine what was underneath it. "Yes, I suppose it would be." Edmund cleared his throat. "She's made a good start of it, actually. The raised beds came out rather well." "I'm sure they did," said his mother. Miss Marple took a small bite of her fruit scone. The marmalade was excellent, sharp and properly bitter, the kind that required good instinct and patience to make well. She thought of Dorothea's expression when the plate had been presented to her, not distaste. Something more complicated than that. The conversation moved on, to the fete, to the question of whether the village hall roof would survive another winter without attention, to a mildly entertaining account from Reverend Harkesel of a christening that had gone sideways in a manner he described as spiritually instructive. Caroline Pemberton laughed most freely at this, and Dr. Pemberton smiled at his wife with the particular expression of a man who is pleased by something he cannot quite account for. It was near 5 o'clock when Honoria rose to collect the empty plates, declining offers of assistance in the practiced way of a woman who prefers her kitchen to herself. The room relaxed almost imperceptibly in her absence. Edmund moved to stand near his wife. Miss Marple, who had been in quiet conversation with Mrs. Stockbridge about the lending library's recent acquisitions, allowed her attention to drift. "You've been very quiet," Edmund said, low enough not to carry, though not, perhaps, quite low enough. "I'm always quiet," Dorothea replied, in a tone that suggested this was not entirely a matter of temperament. She was perfectly pleasant. She was exactly as she always is. Edmund said nothing further. Miss Marple turned a page of the lending library's summer catalogue, which Mrs. Stockbridge had produced from her bag, and made a small sound of interest at a title she had no particular feeling about. Caroline Pemberton drifted toward the corner table, ostensibly to examine the arrangement of sweet peas Honoria had cut from the garden and set in a narrow-necked vase. She stood with her back partly to the room and spoke at a volume calibrated, Miss Marple thought with some precision. "She does put on a wonderful spread," Caroline said to no one and everyone. "One must give her that." "She always has," said Mrs. Stockbridge warmly. "Gerald used to say nobody in the county made a better scone," said the Reverend. is with the affectionate nostalgia he reserved for the safely deceased. "Yes," said Caroline. She touched one finger lightly to the vase, straightening it a fraction that required no straightening. "Though I do think it's sweet that she still uses his recipes. One wonders whether she'll ever really feel free to change anything." The observation floated in the room for a moment, neither landed nor fully airborne. Dorothea's cup, Miss Marple noticed, was perfectly still in its saucer. Honoria returned carrying a small plate of shortbread, and the moment dissolved as such moments do, cleanly and without residue, leaving only the faint trace of something that had been, if one were paying attention, rather pointed. The guests departed between 5:30 and 6. Miss Marple was among the last to leave, and accepting her coat from the hall stand with unhurried grace, while Honoria saw the Reverend to the door. In the hallway she paused. On the small console table beside the hall stand, set among the customary arrangement of post, a folded umbrella, and a ceramic bowl of keys, was a glass bottle, the small brown kind used by chemists. It bore no label. It had been pushed not quite successfully behind the bowl. Miss Marple did not touch it. She did not stare at it. She simply noted it, with the quiet, unhurried precision of a woman to whom small things had long ceased to seem small, and allowed Honoria to help her with her coat, and said what a perfectly lovely afternoon it had been. Walking home along the high street in the long golden light of the May evening, she thought about discipline, about consistency, about the kind of attention one pays to living things when one wishes to shape the direction of their growth. And she thought about Marmalade, who had been served it, and who, upon reflection, had not. Honoria Fitch was found at 8:20 on Monday morning by her daily Mrs. Brenda Hogg, who had come to collect the tea things left from the previous afternoon, and found instead her employer seated in the high-backed chair, the same chair she had occupied with such authority the evening before, quite dead. Mrs. Hogg, to her considerable credit, did not scream. She stood in the doorway of the drawing-room for a moment that she would later describe as feeling very long, and then she went to the telephone in the hall and called Dr. Pemberton, because that was what one did in Cetford Magna, and then she sat down on the hall-stand bench and waited, and did not touch anything, and felt, obscurely, that she had done her duty. Dr. Pemberton arrived within 10 minutes, examined Honoria with the quiet efficiency of long practice, and called the police. He said very little to Mrs. Hogg beyond asking her to wait in the kitchen, which she did, making herself a cup of tea that she did not drink. By 9:30, a police constable had arrived from the market town of Ashworth, followed shortly by Detective Inspector Rowe, a solid, unhurried man of 45, who had the look of someone who had seen enough of human difficulty to have stopped being surprised by it without having stopped being affected. He moved through Wisteria Cottage methodically and spoke to Mrs. Hogg with the patient courtesy of a man who understood that frightened witnesses require settling before they become useful ones. The village naturally knew something was wrong before any official word had been given. This was not a failure of discretion on anyone's part. It was simply the nature of Cetford Magna, where the arrival of a police car in the high street before 10 in the morning was a fact too visible and too extraordinary to remain uninterpreted. By 11 o'clock, 3 separate and entirely confident versions of events were already in circulation. Miss Marple heard about Honoria Fitch's death from Mrs. Stockbridge, who telephoned at 20 to 10 in a state of controlled distress that would, Miss Marple gently suspected, have been rather less controlled had Mrs. Stockbridge lived alone. As it was, she had her companion, a cat named Bertram, and the steadying habit of decades of facing difficult news by first telling someone else about it. Brenda Hogg found her, Mrs. Stockbridge said. In the chair, apparently. Alistair Pemberton was called straight away. There are police at the house now. How very dreadful, said Miss Marple, which was true, and which conveyed, as she intended it to, the full weight of the fact without adding to it. She seemed perfectly well yesterday. Didn't she seem perfectly well to you? She seemed very much herself, Miss Marple said carefully. There was a brief pause. What do you think it was? I really couldn't say. These things can come very suddenly. Mrs. Stockbridge accepted this with the mild dissatisfaction of someone who had hoped for more, and rang off after another minute. Miss Marple set down the telephone and stood for a moment in her sitting room, looking out at her own garden, smaller and less severe than Honoria's, but reasonably well tended. A blackbird was investigating the border near the gate with optimistic persistence. She thought about the brown bottle behind the ceramic bowl. She thought about Dorothea's hands, held too still in her lap. She thought about the marmalade, specifically about the fact that only one pot of it had been brought to the table, and that it had been placed without particular ceremony before Miss Marple's own corner chair, and that Honoria had helped herself to the raspberry jam throughout the afternoon, and had not, as far as Miss Marple had observed, touched the Seville marmalade at all. She put on her coat and went out. The activity around Wisteria Cottage had, by mid-morning, acquired the organised quality of official procedure. A second constable had appeared. There was a vehicle Miss Marple did not recognise parked at an angle to the gate, and a small number of village residents had found reasons to walk past slowly, twice. Miss Marple did not join them. She walked instead toward the Ashworth Road, turned left at the chemist, and went into the lending library, where she spent 20 minutes in conversation with Mrs. Partridge, the librarian, who had the considerable advantage, in terms of local knowledge, of hearing everything that anyone in Cetford Magna had ever said within 6 feet of the returns desk. She learned, in the course of a discussion that touched on large print editions, the summer reading programme, and the general decline of the epistolary novel, that Dorothea Fitch had been seen on the previous Thursday in the chemist, that she had been there for some time, that she had spoken to Mr. Aldis, the pharmacist, at the counter rather than through the collection window, and that she had been carrying, when she left, a small paper bag of the kind used for medicinal rather than cosmetic purchases. This was offered not as suspicion but as fact, in the way that Mrs. Partridge offered most local intelligence, with the disinterested thoroughness of someone cataloguing rather than concluding. Miss Marple thanked her warmly, borrowed a P.D. James she had already read, and walked home by a slightly longer route that took her past the surgery. Dr. Pemberton's car was not there. This was, she reflected, not surprising given the morning's events. Oh, but there was a light on in the upstairs window of the house attached to the practice, and after a moment it went out, and the shadow that had been briefly visible at the glass, too slight for the doctor, too restless for repose, withdrew. Caroline Pemberton, it seemed, was also watching the street. Miss Marple walked on, the borrowed novel under her arm, thinking about Thursday, and about small paper bags, and about what it means to watch a street from an upstairs window when what is happening in the street has nothing, officially, to do with you. Detective Inspector Rowe had, in his 22 years of police work, developed a healthy suspicion of villages. Cities, in his experience, were more honestly dangerous. They made no pretense of warmth. He offered no consoling routine of tea and committee meetings, behind which difficulty might quietly arrange itself. Villages, on the other hand, presented a surface so thoroughly agreeable that the effort required to see beneath it was considerable, and the effort was not always made. He sat now in the small front parlour of the Fitch house, Honoria's body having been removed with professional discretion some hours earlier, and looked across the low table at Edmund Fitch, who was composed in the way that people are composed when they have decided in advance to be. "Your mother had no history of cardiac trouble?" Rowe asked, though he had already put this to Dr. Pemberton and received a qualified answer. "Not that I was aware of." Edmund paused. She was not the sort of person who discussed her health." "And she seemed well to you yesterday at the gathering. She seemed entirely herself." Rowe noted this. It was the second time he had heard that precise phrase used of Honoria Fitch within the hour, the first having come from Miss Marple, a small, bright-eyed elderly woman who had been leaving the lending library as he passed it on his way back from the house, and who had stopped to introduce herself with an air of pleasant inconsequence that he had not, upon reflection, found entirely convincing. "A terrible thing," she had said, "such a vital woman. One of those people who seem permanently fixed, if you understand me, as though the ordinary hazards of life simply wouldn't dare." He had agreed that it was a terrible thing, and had moved on, and had found himself, 1 or 2 streets later, mildly uncertain why the conversation had left him feeling that something had been handed to him that he had not yet had occasion to unwrap. He returned his attention to Edmund. "Your wife, she's resting." "She didn't sleep well." A brief hesitation. "She and my mother were not. They had their difficulties. She's taking it harder than one might expect." "That happens," said Rowe neutrally. Edmund looked at his hands. He had the appearance of a man who had prepared answers to several questions, and was finding that the questions being asked were not quite the ones he had anticipated. "Inspector, I wonder, is there any indication yet of what, I mean, at her age, one assumes—" "We're awaiting the post-mortem," Rowe said. "Standard procedure in cases of sudden death." Edmund absorbed this. "Oh, of course." After a further 10 minutes of largely administrative conversation, Rowe took his leave and stood for a moment in the hall, looking at the console table, the bowl of keys, the folded umbrella, the small accumulation of ordinary domestic life. The constable had catalogued everything naturally. The brown bottle, noted in the report as present and unlabelled, had been collected for examination, though the working assumption remained that it was something entirely mundane, a remedy for something minor. Misplaced and forgotten. Rowe was not certain he shared the working assumption, but he was a methodical man, and he would wait for the post-mortem before deciding what he thought. The post-mortem came back the following morning with a finding that the working assumption had not prepared for. Honoria Fitch had died of cardiac arrest. That much was straightforward. What was less straightforward was the presence, in her system, of a quantity of digitalis that exceeded what any prescribed therapeutic dose would produce, and that bore no relation to any medication she was known to have been taking. Dr. Pemberton, when informed, went very still in the manner of a man receiving news that falls into a category he had hoped would not be entered. Inspector Rowe drove back to Cetford Magna on Tuesday morning with the kind of focused quiet that preceded, in his experience, a significant revision of everything that had initially seemed obvious. He called first on Dr. Pemberton. The doctor received him in the surgery, which smelled of antiseptic and old wood, and had about it the particular atmosphere of a room in which difficult things are regularly said and absorbed. Pemberton sat behind his desk with his hands folded and listened to what the inspector had to say without visible agitation, which Rowe noted. "Digitalis," the doctor said when Rowe had finished. "You're certain?" "The lab is." Pemberton was quiet for a moment. "She wasn't prescribed it. I can confirm that, absolutely. Her cardiac health was, well, she had mild hypertension, managed, nothing that would warrant digitalis." "Is it something that might be obtained without prescription?" "Not easily. Not through legitimate means." Pemberton looked at the middle distance. "It occurs in plants, of course. Foxglove, principally. In sufficient concentration," he stopped. "Yes," said Rowe. Another silence. "Then you'll want to speak to everyone who was present on Sunday." "I will." Pemberton nodded slowly. "I should tell you, it may be nothing, but I was informed, in passing, that Dorothea Fitch visited the chemist last week." "I mention it only because it's relevant," Rowe said. "Because it may be," Pemberton corrected, with the precision of a man who understood the weight of what he was doing. Rowe thanked him and left. He sat in his car outside the surgery for a moment, looking at the high street, the pleasant curve of it, the chestnut trees, the war memorial with its fading sweet williams. He thought about Dorothea Fitch, who had visited the chemist. He thought about the unlabelled bottle. He thought about Edmund Fitch saying she's taking it harder than one might expect, it in the tone of a man performing loyalty he had not entirely decided upon. The picture, he felt, was becoming clearer. He was experienced enough to know that this was precisely the moment to be most careful. Pictures that became clear quickly had a way of developing, upon closer examination, in quite a different direction. But Dorothea Fitch was the most evident explanation. And evident explanations had a gravity that was difficult, in practice, to resist. The foxgloves in Cetford Magna were that year particularly fine. They grew along the north-facing wall of the churchyard in tall, authoritative columns, deep purple and white, the bells hanging with a precision that suggested they too were aware of being observed. They grew in Mrs. Stockbridge's front border, and along the lane that ran behind the village hall, and in the cutting garden that Honoria Fitch had maintained with such exacting care at the far end of her property. Miss Marple had always found foxgloves beautiful, in the way that certain truthful things are beautiful, directly, without apology, and with a clarity that did not trouble itself to be comfortable. She was thinking about them on Tuesday morning as she dead-headed the sweet williams in her own front border, a task that required little conscious attention and therefore left the greater part of her mind free for more purposeful work. She had heard through Mrs. Stockbridge, who had heard it from Brenda Hogg, who had a cousin in the administrative offices at Ashworth General, that the post-mortem had returned something unexpected. The word unexpected had been the precise word used, and Miss Marple, who understood the grammar of village rumour as well as she understood most things, took it to mean something specific rather than something vague. She clipped a stem with more decision than the plant required, and thought about digitalis. She thought about it in the way she thought about most things, not dramatically, but steadily, turning it in her mind as one turns a piece of needlework to examine the underside. Digitalis from foxglove was not a sophisticated poison. It was an old one, a country one, if one were being precise about it, the kind that requires patience and knowledge rather than access to anything modern or difficult. the kind that a person might arrive at not through research, but through familiarity, through years of working near the plants, understanding their properties, knowing what they were capable of. The Honoria had kept foxgloves in her cutting garden for 20 years. The question, Miss Marple reflected, was not whether the knowledge existed in Cetford Magna. The question was who had chosen to apply it, and when, and in what precise form, and, most importantly, through what vehicle. Because digitalis required a vehicle. It was bitter. It needed something to carry it, to make it palatable, to ensure it was taken at the right moment by the right person, without producing the kind of immediate and obvious distress that would invite immediate and obvious questions. She considered the tea things. She considered the shortbread. She considered the small pots of cream. And then she considered again the marmalade. Inspector Rowe's interview with Honoria Fitch took place at 11 o'clock on Tuesday morning, and in the sitting room of the house she shared with Edmund on Barrow Lane. A comfortable house, rather less assertive than Wisteria Cottage, with the slightly provisional atmosphere of a home whose occupants have not entirely agreed on what it ought to look like. Dorothea received him alone. Edmund had gone, she sobbed, to deal with matters relating to the estate. She said this without inflection. She was, Rowe thought, a striking woman, not pretty in any conventional sense, but possessed of a quality of attention, a quality of being entirely present in whatever she inhabited that made her difficult to look away from. She sat across from him with her hands in her lap and waited for him to speak first, which was, he noted, not what most people did. "Mrs. Fitch," he began. "Well, I understand you visited Aldis the chemist last Thursday." "I did. Could you tell me what for?" "Iron tablets," she said. "I've been anemic. Dr. Pemberton recommended supplementation." Rowe wrote this down. "And Mr. Aldis can confirm that?" "I would expect so. He served me himself." A pause. "There was a bottle found in the hallway of Wisteria Cottage," Rowe said, watching her. "Small, brown, unlabelled. Do you know anything about it?" Something moved across Dorothea's face, not guilt precisely, more like recognition, as though a card she had been holding had been named. "No," she said, "I don't." "You had a difficult relationship with your mother-in-law. Most people who knew Honoria well had a complicated relationship with her," Dorothea said, with a composure that cost her something, Rowe felt. And though he couldn't have said how he knew, she was a complicated woman. "Edmund tells me you're taking her death harder than might be expected." A brief silence. "Edmund," she said carefully, "sometimes interprets anxiety as grief." Rowe looked at her. "And what are you anxious about, Mrs. Fitch?" She met his gaze with the level quality of someone who has decided, in advance, how much to reveal. "I'm anxious," she said, "because my mother-in-law is dead, and the police are in my sitting room. I think that's fairly ordinary, Inspector." He left shortly after, without having obtained anything that could be called a contradiction, and with the persistent feeling that Honoria Fitch was several steps ahead of the conversation she was participating in. Miss Marple called on Caroline Pemberton that afternoon, under the agreeable pretext of returning a gardening catalogue that Caroline had lent her some weeks prior, and that she had, in truth, already returned, a small domestic fiction whose purpose was entirely social. Caroline received her in the kitchen, which smelled of coffee and something baked, and was warmer and less formal than the rest of the house. She was clearly glad of company in the way that people are glad of company when they have been alone with their thoughts for too long. "It's a dreadful business," she said, filling the kettle. "Alistair is terribly affected. He doesn't show it. You know how he is." but he's been up since 5 both mornings." "It must be very difficult," said Miss Marple, "to be so close to it professionally and personally at once." "They were close," Caroline said, and then amended, "Honoria and Alistair, our old friends. He'd looked after her for 30 years. A long time," Miss Marple agreed. Caroline set out cups with slightly more force than the task required. "The police have been to see Dorothea." "Have they?" "Edmund rang Alistair this morning. He's worried." She paused. "I don't think Dorothea did it. I want to be clear about that. Whatever one might think about, I don't think she's capable of something like that." "It's interesting," said Miss Marple gently, "that the question of capability is where your mind goes." Caroline turned from the counter. For a moment, she looked at Miss Marple with an expression that was not quite alarm and not quite recognition, but occupied the narrow space between them. Then she turned back to the kettle and said nothing further. Miss Marple looked around the kitchen with mild, unpleasant interest, at the herbs on the window-sill, the cookbooks on the shelf, the small wooden rack beside the cooker where Caroline kept her most used implements. Among them, tucked between a ladle and a set of measuring spoons, was a jar of Seville marmalade. Opened, the seal broken, the same dark amber colour as the pot that had sat, barely touched, on Honoria Fitch's Sunday table. Miss Marple accepted her cup of coffee with a warm smile, and said what a comfort it was, in difficult times, to have a neighbour one could simply sit with. And Caroline Pemberton agreed, and smiled, and did not notice where her guest's eyes had briefly rested. There is a particular kind of friendship that forms between people who have known each other long enough to have accumulated, along with the warmth, a precise and mutual knowledge of each other's weaknesses. It is not a lesser friendship for this. In some respects, it is a more honest one. But it carries, beneath its comfortable surface, a weight that newer acquaintances do not possess. The weight of everything that has been observed and remembered and never quite said. Alistair Pemberton and Honoria Fitch had been friends of this kind for 31 years. Miss Marple had not known this with any precision before Tuesday afternoon, but she knew it by Tuesday evening, having spent a productive hour with Mrs. Stockbridge, who had a memory for social history that most county archivists would have envied, and who required only the mildest encouragement to deploy it. They sat in Mrs. Stockbridge's sitting room, a comfortable, slightly overcrowded room that smelled of old paper and the particular wool that Bertram the cat preferred to sleep on, and drank sherry, which Mrs. Stockbridge poured with a generous hand, and talked about Honoria Fitch in the way that one talks about the recently dead in English villages, with affection, accuracy, and the faintest undercurrent of relief that one can now say certain things without consequence. She and Alistair were very close in the early years, Mrs. Stockbridge said. Before Caroline, Honoria had a particular, well, one doesn't like to say claim on him, but she felt, I think, that their friendship carried a certain priority, a certain precedence. And when he married, Miss Marple asked, she was gracious about it, publicly. Mrs. Stockbridge considered her sherry. Honoria was always gracious publicly. It was one of her great talents. And privately. A measured pause. She made certain things difficult. Nothing one could point to directly. But Caroline never felt. She never felt entirely welcomed. Even after all these years, even after... She stopped. Yes, said Miss Marple, with the gentle patience of someone who understands that the most useful information frequently lives just past the point where people naturally stop. Mrs. Stockbridge looked at her hands. There was an episode some years ago, perhaps 7, 8 years. I don't know all the details. I only know what one hears, and one tries to be careful about that." She paused. There were difficulties in Alistair and Caroline's marriage, a period of distance. And Honoria was present during that period in a way that Caroline has never forgotten. Whether she precipitated anything or simply took advantage of an existing situation, I genuinely couldn't say. But Caroline has known about it for a long time, and she has managed it, which is not the same thing as forgetting it. Miss Marple said nothing. She looked at the middle distance with an expression of mild thoughtfulness, and turned her sherry glass slowly between her palms. "Gerald knew," Mrs. Stockbridge added. "Gerald Fitch. He was a perceptive man, rather underestimated. He knew what Honoria was capable of, I think, better than most, but he was devoted to her nonetheless, or perhaps because of it. Some people are like that." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Some people are very much like that." On Wednesday morning, Edmund Fitch came to see Inspector Rowe. He came without announcement and without his solicitor, which Rowe took as the gesture it was, a man arriving to say something he had decided, after some internal struggle, needed saying. He sat down, declined tea, and looked at the middle distance for a moment before speaking. "There is something I should have mentioned earlier," he said. "I want to be clear that I am not making an accusation, but I think you should know." "Go on," said Rowe. "My mother kept a kitchen journal. Recipes, largely, but also notes about the garden. What she'd planted, what she'd harvested, what she'd prepared from the garden produce. She had done it for years. Gerald started it, actually. It was his idea, and she continued it after he died. Where is this journal? That's the difficulty." Edmund looked at him directly. "I've searched the house. Mrs. Hogg has searched. It isn't there. It should be in the kitchen dresser. It was always in the kitchen dresser, but it isn't." Rowe was quiet for a moment. "When did you last see it?" "I can't be certain. 2 or 3 weeks ago, perhaps. I was at the house for dinner, and it was in its usual place." He paused. "I noticed it because my mother referred to it during the meal. She'd been making preserves. She mentioned she'd been experimenting with a new method." "What kind of preserves?" Edmund looked at him. "Marmalade. Seville orange. She made it every year. She was rather proud of it." After Edmund left, Rose sat at his desk for a long moment. Then he picked up his telephone and called the laboratory at Ashworth and asked them, when they examined the contents of the unlabelled bottle collected from Wisteria Cottage, and to look specifically for any compound derived from Digitalis purpurea, in a preparation consistent with a concentrated extract, rather than a pharmaceutical form. He then made a second call to Mr. Aldis at the chemist, and asked as a matter of thoroughness whether anyone other than Dorothea Fitch had made any purchases in the past month that might be relevant to the case. Mr. Aldis was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully that he wasn't certain it was relevant, but that Dr. Pemberton had been in on the previous Wednesday, the day before Dorothea's visit, and had asked about the properties of cardiac glycosides in the context of, he had said, a patient query. A patient query. Rose set down the telephone and looked out of his window at the unremarkable view of the Ashworth car park, and thought about what it meant that a doctor of 30 years' experience required a chemist to explain to him the properties of a class of compounds he would have learned in his second year of medical training. And he thought about the journal that was no longer in the kitchen dresser. And he thought that the picture, which had seemed so usefully clear 2 days ago, had developed precisely as he had feared into something else entirely. Wednesday afternoon brought rain, the soft, persistent kind that settles over English villages with a proprietary air, as though it has always been there and merely become visible. It darkened the chestnut trees and turned the high street stones to a deep, reflective grey, and drove indoors anyone who had found a reason to be outdoors, which, in Cetford Magna, given the events of the past 3 days, had been a considerable number of people. Miss Marple sat by her sitting-room window with her knitting, a pale blue cardigan for her great-niece that had been in progress since February and showed no particular signs of urgency, and watched the rain with the comfortable attention of someone who finds weather genuinely interesting. She had been thinking, in the methodical and unhurried way that was her natural mode, about the kitchen journal. Its absence was, she felt, more instructive than its presence would have been. A journal present in its usual place in the kitchen dresser would have told her something about Honoria's habits and methods. A journal removed by the evidence of Edmund's account sometime in the past 2 or 3 weeks, during a period in which Honoria had been making preserves, told her something considerably more useful. It told her that someone had understood before Honoria died that the journal would eventually be looked for, that its contents would eventually become relevant. That required a particular kind of foresight, the cold, preparatory foresight of someone who had already decided what they were going to do. She set down her knitting and thought about Caroline Pemberton's kitchen, the opened jar of Seville marmalade, tucked among the implements by the cooker, the same distinctive amber, the same dark peel visible through the glass. It was not, of itself, conclusive. Seville marmalade was not an unusual thing to possess in an English kitchen in late May. One could purchase it at any reasonable grocer. But Honoria had made her own, and had been proud of it, and had, according to Edmund, been experimenting with a new method. And the jar in Caroline's kitchen had not been a commercial jar. It had been a preserving jar, the wide-mouthed clip-top variety that one used for homemade preparations, with a square of cloth over the lid rather than a printed label. The kind Honoria used, the kind one might receive as a gift from an old friend. Miss Marple picked up her knitting again and worked 3 rows in thoughtful silence. The second disturbance came at 4:30. It came in the form of a telephone call to Inspector Rowe from Constable Jeffreys, who had been stationed, largely as a matter of form, at Wisteria Cottage, while the house remained a subject of active inquiry. Jeffreys reported that Edmund Fitch, who had returned to the house that afternoon to collect some personal items, had found the kitchen in a state of moderate disorder. Drawers opened, the contents of the dresser shifted, and had telephoned the station in a state of controlled agitation to report that someone had been in. Rowe arrived at the house within 20 minutes. He moved through the kitchen with careful attention, touching nothing, observing the particular geography of disruption. Not a ransacking, nothing so crude as that. More, the trace of a focused search. The dresser drawers had been opened and the items within them moved, but replaced with a degree of care that suggested the searcher had not wanted the intrusion to be immediately obvious. Had Edmund not known precisely where the journal ought to have been, and had he not been looking, specifically, for evidence of its absence, he might not have noticed anything at all. Was anything taken? Rowe asked. Edmund looked around the kitchen with the strained attention of a man trying to inventory a room he has spent his life walking through without cataloguing. I can't be certain. I don't think so. I think whatever they were looking for, they either found it or determined it wasn't here. The journal. If the journal were here, they've taken it. If it was already gone, he stopped. Then they came to confirm it was gone, Roe finished. Edmund looked at him. Yes. Roe stood for a moment in the centre of the kitchen and looked at the dresser. Its familiar domestic arrangement, the cups on hooks, the plates behind glass, the small disorder that someone had tried, not entirely successfully, to conceal. But the window above the sink looked out onto the back garden, which gave, through a gate in the far wall, onto the lane that ran between the properties of Barrow Lane and the High Street. The lane that ran, among other places, behind the surgery. He did not say this to Edmund. He thanked him for calling promptly, asked him not to touch anything further, and left Constable Jeffreys with instructions. Miss Marple was not surprised when Inspector Roe appeared at her door at 5:30. She had been expecting someone, though she had not been entirely certain who. She brought him into the sitting room, offered tea which he declined, and sat across from him with her hands folded in her lap, and gave him the full attention of someone who understands that certain conversations require it. He told her, with the directness of a man who has revised his assumptions twice in 3 days, and found the experience instructive, about the kitchen, about the lane, about the doctor's visit to the chemist, and about the marmalade. He had heard about the marmalade from Constable Jeffreys, who had spoken that morning to Mrs. Stockbridge, who had mentioned, in the course of a conversation about something else entirely, that Miss Marple had called on Caroline Pemberton the previous afternoon. Miss Marple listened to all of this without expression. "You've been looking into this yourself," Rose said. It was not quite an accusation. "I have been visiting friends," Miss Marple replied, with perfect composure. During a difficult time for the village, it seemed the natural thing to do. Roe looked at her for a moment. He had the impression, and not for the first time, of speaking to someone operating on a level of the conversation that he had not quite reached. "Miss Marple," he said, "if you know something, I know a great many things," she said gently. "The difficulty is knowing which of them are fact and which are simply patterns. The two can look very similar from a distance." She paused. "But there is something I think you should verify. The marmalade that was served on Sunday, Honoria's own, from her kitchen. I believe you will find that Miss Honoria did not herself take any of it during the gathering." Roe was still. "And I believe," Miss Marple continued, in the same quiet conversational tone, "that if you were to ask Dr. Pemberton where he was on Wednesday afternoon, not Tuesday, Wednesday, between 2 and 4 o'clock, his answer would be worth examining carefully." She picked up her knitting. "More tea, Inspector. I find it rather helps on days like this." Thursday morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows a day of rain. The air washed clean, the light sharp and without apology. The village colours restored to a brightness that felt, under the circumstances, faintly indecent. Miss Marple walked to the post office at 9 o'clock and back by the longer route, and stopped twice, once to speak to the greengrocer's wife about nothing of consequence, and once to examine the foxgloves along the churchyard wall with the attentive appreciation of someone who finds them genuinely beautiful, and not, in the present climate, at all ironic. She was composing, as she walked, the precise shape of what she intended to do that afternoon. Inspector Roe had verified, the previous evening, that Dr. Pemberton's account of his Wednesday afternoon was imprecise, in ways that a man of his habitual exactitude would not, under ordinary circumstances, permit. He had said when asked that he had been at the surgery until 4 and then at home. The surgery's appointment book placed his last patient at 2:15, and Mrs. Holt, the receptionist, who kept her own private record of the comings and goings of the practice with the thoroughness of a woman who understands that such records have value, confirmed that Dr. Pemberton had left the surgery at approximately 2:45 and had not returned. 40 minutes were unaccounted for. 40 minutes during which the lane behind Wisteria Cottage was a 4-minute walk from the surgery's rear exit. This was suggestive. It was not, our Miss Marple reflected, sufficient. Inspector Rowe understood this too, which was why, when she had outlined to him, carefully and without dramatics, what she proposed to do on Thursday afternoon, he had listened with more attention than scepticism, and had agreed to be available with Constable Jeffreys. At a distance that would allow swift movement without visible presence. What Miss Marple proposed was simple. It was, she had explained to the inspector, a very old method, older than detective work, older than formal inquiry of any kind. It relied on nothing more sophisticated than the fact that people who have done something they should not have done carry always a portion of their attention in that direction. One does not need to name a thing to cause a person to look toward it. One needs only to stand in the right place and speak in the right register, and allow human nature to do what it reliably does. She had seen it work in St. Mary Mead more times than she could comfortably count. She telephoned Dr. Pemberton at 11 o'clock and asked with the pleasant vagueness of an elderly woman managing a minor domestic uncertainty whether he might have a few minutes that afternoon. A small matter, she said, nothing urgent. She had been finding the recent events rather affecting, and she valued his steadiness. He was, she said, someone the village trusted. He agreed to come at 3. He arrived precisely on time, punctuality being, Miss Marple had long observed, a quality that sits very close in certain temperaments to the need for control, and he was well dressed in the manner of a man who dresses with care when he is uncertain of the situation he is entering, and he accepted the chair she indicated and the cup of tea she poured with the composed ease of a man determined to appear untroubled. Miss Marple settled across from him and began as she had planned, some distance from the point. She spoke about Honoria, about the Sunday gathering, about the roses, about the quality of the marmalade, about Gerald Fitch, and what a solid and perceptive man he had been. Pemberton responded appropriately, warmly even, with the ease of someone navigating familiar emotional territory. He had known Honoria a long time, he said. It was a significant loss. One of those friendships, Miss Marple said gently, that have their own particular complexity. The long ones always do. So much accumulated between people over 30 years. The kindnesses and the other things. Something shifted in Pemberton's expression. Barely perceptible. A slight contraction. A refocusing of attention. I suppose that's true, he said carefully. I was thinking, Miss Marple continued in the same mild ruminative tone, about the preserves. Honoria's marmalade. She was so proud of it. Gerald's recipe, of course, though she'd adapted it considerably over the years. She told me once that the secret was in the preparation, the time one takes at certain stages. She paused. I wonder what will happen to all of her recipes now, whether Edmund will think to look for the kitchen journal. The cup in Pemberton's hand was entirely still, not the stillness of relaxation, or the stillness of arrested motion, the stillness of a man who had stopped himself from doing something. Moving, speaking, reacting. I wouldn't know about that, he said. "No," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I don't suppose you would." She offered shortbread, which he declined, and moved the conversation smoothly sideward, to the fete, to the question of the village hall roof, to a pleasantly circular discussion of whether the lending library ought to extend its Thursday hours. Pemberton responded to all of this with the surface fluency of a man who has survived the worst moment of an encounter and is now carefully managing his exit. But Miss Marple had seen what she needed to see. She had watched his right hand, resting on the arm of the chair, press once, briefly, with quiet force, against the upholstery, at precisely the moment she said kitchen journal. A small muscular response, involuntary, the kind the body makes when something is named that it has been holding in sustained and careful tension. She had seen it before. In St. Mary Mead, in a man named Hartley, who had known where a set of missing deeds were kept, and had spent 3 weeks denying it, while his left hand, whenever the subject was raised, found the edge of the nearest surface and gripped. The body, in Miss Marple's experience, was a considerably more honest narrator than the mouth. Pemberton left at 3:20, shaking her hand with warmth, saying it had been good to talk, that he was glad she was bearing up. She thanked him and stood at the door until he had turned the corner at the end of the lane. Then she went inside and telephoned Inspector Rowe. He knew about the journal, she said when he answered. He knew precisely what it contained and precisely why it matters. I'm now quite certain about the order of events. A pause. There is one further thing I need to establish. It concerns Caroline. Miss Marple, I am not going to do anything inadvisable, Inspector. I am going to have a conversation. People tell one a great deal, she said with the quiet authority of 7 decades of careful listening, when they believe they are being comforted. She rang off and sat for a moment in the pleasant afternoon light of her sitting room, looking at the 2 teacups on the table, hers half finished, his barely touched, and thought about 31 years of friendship, and what accumulates in that time, and what, under sufficient pressure, it eventually becomes. The Caroline Pemberton opened the door before Miss Marple had finished knocking, which suggested she had seen her coming from the upstairs window, the same window from which, 3 days earlier, her shadow had withdrawn from the glass with the swift, guilty reflex of someone watching a street that had nothing, officially, to do with her. She looked, Miss Marple thought, like a woman who had not slept in several nights, and had become, in that sleeplessness, oddly clarified, the way certain things become clearer when the surrounding noise is removed. Her eyes were bright, and her colour was poor, and she held the door with a grip that was not quite steady. "Miss Marple," she said. "My dear," said Miss Marple warmly, "I hope I'm not intruding. I found myself walking this way and thought, well, one doesn't like to think of people sitting alone with difficult things." Caroline stepped back and let her in. They sat in the kitchen again, the warm room, the herbs on the sill, the wooden rack beside the cooker. The marmalade jar was gone. Miss Marple noticed this without remarking on it, and accepted her tea and waited with the patient, unhurried quality of someone who understands that certain things cannot be rushed toward. They must be allowed to arrive. They sat in silence for a moment, a silence that was not uncomfortable, but that had weight and direction. "Alistair came home at 4 yesterday," Caroline said, without preamble. "He was very quiet. He's been very quiet since Sunday." She looked at her cup. "I know that kind of quiet. I've known it before." "Yes," said Miss Marple gently. "He was with her. Oh, wasn't he?" It was not a question. Miss Marple considered her response with the care it deserved. "I think," she said, "that your husband visited Wisteria Cottage on Wednesday afternoon, and I think that what he went there to do was remove something. A journal, something that connected certain preparations, certain things made in that kitchen, to what happened on Sunday." Caroline's hands were very still around her cup. "He didn't know," she said. Her voice was low and even. The voice of someone who has rehearsed this, who has said it to herself in the dark over several nights. "About what I'd put in the jar. He found it afterward. He worked it out, the way he works things out, quietly and alone, and then he went to remove the evidence of it before anyone else could find it." She paused. "He didn't tell me. He simply did it, to protect me." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a pigeon landed on the windowsill, regarded the herbs briefly, and departed. "The jar," Miss Marple said. "You gave it to her as a gift." "At Christmas. She made her own every year. Everyone knew that. It was one of her great productions. But she'd mentioned to Alistair that her crop of Sevilles had been poor last winter, that she might not manage a full batch. So I said I'd make some. She seemed pleased." A brief, complicated pause. "She seemed pleased because she thought it was a concession, an offering. She collected those from people." "And you had time," Miss Marple said quietly, "to prepare it carefully." "I've kept foxgloves in my garden for 15 years. I knew what they were capable of. I knew the quantities." She said this not with pride, but with the flat precision of someone stating a fact they have stopped trying to soften. "I made the extract over several weeks. I was careful. I made it concentrated enough that a small amount, the amount one might take from a single jar of marmalade, over several months, would accumulate gradually, would look, eventually, like cardiac failure in a woman of 73. But she didn't use it. She never opened it." Something crossed Caroline's face. Not relief, not irony, but something between the two. Something without a clean name. She thanked me very graciously and put it in her larder and continued making her own. I didn't know until the Sunday gathering, when I saw the pot on the table, her own pot, not mine. And then I understood that mine was still in the larder, and that if anyone looked in the larder, you needed to retrieve it. I went back Sunday evening after the gathering. While everyone was still in the village, Honoria was already— She stopped, started again. She was already dead when I got there. She must have taken something else, something earlier. I didn't know that then. I only knew she was dead, and my jar was in the larder, and I took it and came home, and I have not slept since." Miss Marple set down her cup. She looked at Caroline Pemberton, at the exhausted clarity of her, at the years of managed hurt that had arrived, eventually, at this kitchen table, and felt the deep familiar sadness of someone who has lived long enough to understand precisely how ordinary this story was, not in its details, in its origins. In the small or accumulated resentments that people carry until they can no longer carry them, and then set down in the worst possible way. "My dear," she said, "I think you know what must happen now." Caroline looked at her directly. "Yes." "And I think, if you are willing, that it would be better for you to speak to Inspector Rowe yourself, before he arrives at it by other means." She paused. "It will not make what you did right. Nothing will do that. But it may make some small difference to how the rest of this proceeds." Caroline nodded slowly, the motion of someone whose last argument has left them. Miss Marple rose and collected her bag and her coat and paused at the kitchen door. "The jar you took from the larder," she said. "The one that's no longer on the rack." "I poured it down the sink last night," Caroline said. "The jar is in the dustbin." "Tell the inspector that too," Miss Marple said. "Tell him everything in the order it happened. It is always easier, I find, to tell things in the order they happened." She let herself out into the sharp Thursday afternoon and walked home slowly, past the chestnut trees and the War Memorial and the chemist and the lending library, past all the agreeable and familiar surfaces of Cetford Magna. She thought about Honoria, who had been in the end not murdered but thwarted, who had died of her own heart, in her own chair, on the evening after a gathering she had hosted with perfect assurance, who had not, in the event, been poisoned by the woman who had intended to poison her, but had died before that particular sin could be committed, which was not the same as innocence on anyone's part, and which the law would none the less be required to treat as a distinction. It was, she reflected, the kind of outcome that resisted simple moral accounting. Caroline had attempted murder. She had not committed it. What she had committed was something older and less legible. Years of swallowed injury, of watching a woman exercise a quiet, persistent cruelty over her marriage and her happiness, of deciding, in some night hours that she would not remember precisely, that she had borne enough. Miss Marple did not excuse this. She understood it, which was different and considerably more uncomfortable. She let herself into her cottage and put the kettle on and sat in her chair by the window and looked at her garden in the late afternoon light, the sweet williams, the borders, the small and manageable order of it, and thought, as she so often did, about how the worst things people do to each other are almost never done by people who consider themselves bad. They are done by people who have arrived by a long and private road, at a point where they feel the worst thing is the only available thing, which was, she supposed, precisely why one had to pay attention to the roads, long before anyone reached the end of them. The kettle boiled. She made her tea. Outside, the chestnut trees moved in the evening light, and Cetford Magna settled into its Thursday with the quiet, absorbed industry of a village that has had a great deal to process and has not yet finished processing it. It would not be unchanged by this. Nothing ever was. But it would, Miss Marple thought, be all right. Villages generally were. They had, over centuries, developed a remarkable capacity for absorbing the worst of human nature, and continuing, none the less, to put out their flowers in May. She picked up her knitting, the pale blue cardigan still unhurried, and worked quietly until the light faded. Inspector Rowe received Caroline Pemberton's telephone call at 5:20 on Thursday evening. She had called the station directly, not through a solicitor, not through her husband, not through any of the intermediaries that guilt, in his experience, usually reaches for first. She had given her name clearly, stated that she wished to make a voluntary statement regarding the death of Honoria Fitch, and asked, with a composure that he suspected had cost her considerably, whether he might come to the house rather than requiring her to come to Ashworth. He said he would come, but he sat across from her in the kitchen, the warm room that smelled of coffee and herbs, that had about it the particular atmosphere of a place where ordinary life had been proceeding with great determination, alongside something that was not ordinary at all, and he listened to her account from beginning to end without interruption. She told it, as Miss Marple had advised, in the order it had happened. She was precise about quantities and methods and timing in the way that people are precise when they have spent a great deal of time alone with their knowledge of something and have had occasion to examine it from every angle. When she had finished, Rose sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen. "You understand," he said, "that what you've described constitutes attempted murder?" "Yes." "That the fact of Mrs. Fitch's death from natural causes before the poison could take effect does not alter that legal position?" "I understand." He looked at her steadily. She returned his gaze with the level, exhausted quality of someone who has moved through the far side of fear and arrived at something that is not quite peace, but is at least solid ground. "Where is your husband?" he asked. Something moved across her face. "In his study. He knows I've called you." A pause. "He wanted to come with me, to the station. I told him it was something I needed to do alone. Does he know the full extent of it?" "He knows enough." She was quiet for a moment. "He's a good man, Inspector. Whatever you may think of how he handled the journal, he acted to protect me, not himself. I want that to be clearly understood." "It will be considered," Rose said, and which was the most he could offer, and which she accepted without pressing further. He called for Constable Jeffreys, who arrived with the particular combination of efficiency and delicacy that Roe had come to value in him, and the formal process of the evening proceeded with a quietness that felt, under the circumstances, appropriate. There was no drama. There were no raised voices. Caroline Pemberton collected her coat from the hall stand with the measured composure of a woman who has decided that dignity at least remains available to her, and she held it through everything that followed. Alistair Pemberton stood in the doorway of the kitchen as they left. He watched his wife walk down the front path with an expression that Miss Marple, had she been present, would have recognized immediately. The expression of a man comprehending, for the first time and in full, the dimensions of what has been happening in his own house, under his own roof, across the entire length of his inattention. Edmund Fitch was informed on Friday morning. He received the news in the sitting room at Barrow Lane, where Dorothea brought him tea that he did not drink, and sat beside him with the quiet steadiness of a woman who has survived enough to know that survival, in its early stages, requires very little beyond presence. "I don't understand," he said at one point, not as a question, as a statement about the nature of the previous week. "I know," said Dorothea. "She actually—" "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then, Mother never opened the jar. "No, she died of her own heart." He seemed to turn this over with the slow, methodical effort of someone trying to assemble something with pieces that refuse to align. "And Caroline, yes." He looked at his wife. "You knew something was wrong. On Sunday, I saw your face when Honoria brought the scones." Dorothea was quiet for a moment. "I knew there was something between them, something more than the ordinary difficult history. Caroline had said something to me once. Last winter, not clearly, but enough. I didn't know what she intended. I didn't know there was anything to know." She paused. "I was watching her, at the gathering, the way you watch someone when you're not certain of them. You should have told me. I had nothing to tell, only a feeling." She looked at her hands. "One doesn't go to the police with a feeling about a marmalade jar." Edmund made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and they sat together in the quiet of Friday morning, and outside the window the Cetford Magna High Street continued its business with the resolute normality of a place that has absorbed something and is in the early stages of rearranging itself around it. Miss Marple heard the full account of Thursday evening from Inspector Rowe, who called on her Friday afternoon with the air of a man settling an obligation he takes seriously. He told her what Caroline had said, and how she had said it, and what was likely to follow in legal terms, and Miss Marple listened with her hands folded and her expression attentive, and said very little until he had finished. "The journal," she said then. "Did Dr. Pemberton say where he had put it?" "Burned it. Wednesday evening in the garden incinerator." Rowe paused. "He'll face charges in connection with the concealment. He knows that." "Yes." Miss Marple looked at the window. "He would have known it when he did it. That is the nature of that kind of loyalty, I think. One acts first and accounts for it afterward." Rowe considered this. "You knew it was Caroline before Thursday." "I suspected Caroline from quite early on," she said. "The marmalade was the centre of it. Who had served it, who had taken it, and who, crucially, had brought an identical jar into their own kitchen and opened it. One doesn't open a jar of marmalade one has made for another person, as a rule, unless one is confirming that the batch is consistent, and that the other jar, the one already given, contains exactly what one intended it to contain." She was checking her own preparation. She was reassuring herself, Miss Marple said. "There is a difference. People who do terrible things with careful premeditation spend a great deal of time in the period before and after reassuring themselves. It is one of the ways one can identify them, if one is paying attention." Rowe was quiet for a moment. "And Dorothea, the chemist visit, the unlabelled bottle, Dorothea was a distraction, not a deliberate one. She had her own anxieties about the household, her own reasons for discretion. The unlabelled bottle, I suspect, was a proprietary herbal preparation she preferred not to display openly, given the family's medical connections. Something for nerves, most likely. She'd been under considerable strain." "She had," Rowe agreed. He rose to leave, and Miss Marple saw him to the door with the unhurried courtesy of a woman for whom hospitality is a genuine rather than a performed quality. At the door, he paused. "Miss Marple," he said, "for the record, your involvement in this inquiry was, strictly speaking, entirely irregular." "Entirely," she agreed pleasantly. "And if something similar were to occur in future, I should hope," she said with a small, precise smile, "that Cetford Magna has seen enough excitement for some considerable time." Rowe looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion he cannot quite bring himself to state, and then he thanked her and walked down the path to his car. Miss Marple stood at her door a moment longer, she looking at the high street in the Friday afternoon light, the chestnut trees, the war memorial, the lending library with its summer notices in the window. A perfectly ordinary village, the kind of place where nothing, on the surface, ever seemed to happen. She went inside. Her knitting was where she'd left it. The pale blue cardigan waited patiently, as it always did. She picked it up and found her place and continued, stitch by careful stitch, toward the end.